It's Friday, the 9th of December, 2022.
The last word in podcasting news. This is the Pod News Weekly Review with James Cridland and Sam Sethi.
I'm James Cridland, the editor of Pod News.
And I'm Sam Sethi, the host of Sound Talks Technology.
In the chapters today, data everywhere. Who's up, who's down, and who's number one? Recurring Satoshi payments or subscriptions?
This podcast is sponsored and hosted by Buzzsprout. Last week, 3,032 people started a podcast with Buzzsprout. Podcasting hosting made easy with powerful tools and remarkable customer support.
From your daily newsletter, the Pod News Weekly Review.
Buzzsprout this week posted network statistics for November. It's the only regular IAB numbers that are posted, and it says Apple is now 38.2% of all downloads. Spotify's number 2, Google is number 3 in a far, far distance. Tell me more about these stats.
Yeah, so Apple, according to Buzzsprout, I mean, they do these figures every single month, and they're one of two podcast hosting companies that release figures, but the other one is Libsyn, and they're releasing their own figures. They're not the IAB certified ones that Libsyn produces, and so therefore don't really understand what they are. So I kind of ignore them. So Buzzsprouts are suggesting 38.2% of all downloads go to Apple Podcasts, which is nice. Now, I've sort of fiddled around with those because Buzzsprout don't give any Apple Core Media traffic to Apple Podcasts, but also there are quite a lot of podcasts on Apple Podcasts that are never actually listened to. They're automatically downloaded. So once you sort of take all of that stuff away, you can have a look at the figures, and I reckon that Apple is doing about 29.8% of all listens, Spotify 26%, so Google Podcasts 2.7%. So you can see that Apple is still number one, which is really good.
We've got more data. Spotify's Anchor continues to lose market share.
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of data that comes out, obviously, every single month, and you can see that in terms of new podcast episodes, Spotify's Anchor is losing a bit of market share. That said, it's still very much larger than anybody else. It's 21.6% of all new podcast episodes that were published in November. But Megaphone published an increase in the amount of podcast episodes on their platform. So actually Spotify itself has remained the same. It's just that I think this is their long-term plan to move over the big shows from Anchor onto Megaphone and help them earn some money. So interesting seeing that part. There's no other real big changes in the top 15 podcast hosts. You can also have a look at prefix tracking services where PodTrack is doing very well, and Chartable and Podsites doing pretty well too. At number 2, you can look at content delivery systems. CloudFront, run by AWS, is still number 1. And does an awful lot of podcasts, but not this one, because we're sponsored by Buzzsprout, we're hosted by Buzzsprout, and Buzzsprout uses a different content delivery network. I don't suppose that anybody particularly cares about any of that, but nevertheless, that's still sort of vaguely interesting. I think the most interesting thing is the amount of episodes that aren't published during a typical Thanksgiving week in the US. Everybody kind of gives up during Thanksgiving. So we're actually seeing 10% more episodes this week than we did last week when Thanksgiving was on. So, that I think is always interesting to have a look at the data there. But I mean, a ton of charts and things every single month.
Yeah, and again, that's what I say. It depends who you read and who you look at. So I've now got another one that you published, which was SXM Media is now number 1, according to Edison. Again, why are they number 1 now, James?
Well, so there's number 1 in different things, and I think actually everybody says the same thing. So number 1 for downloads, total downloads, or listens, if you like, is always Apple Podcasts. No one has yet published that anybody else is number 1 for that. So Apple Podcasts is always number 1 for downloads. Number 1 for a podcast publisher in the US. Some people claim it's iHeartMedia, Podtrac do. Some people claim it isn't. If you look at Triton claim it's SXM Media, as does the Edison Podcast Metrics data. Now, the Edison Podcast Metrics data is worked out in a slightly different way. They basically ask 11,000 people every year, what podcasts do you listen to? And then they work out who made those particular podcasts. And SXM Media is number one in there. Spotify number 2, iHeartMedia number 3. And the reason why that was interesting and newsworthy is that Spotify was number 1 last quarter, or the figures that Edison brought out last quarter, because they're actually figures over an entire year. So there's an awful lot of number ones. iHeart will still claim that they're number 1 because they're number 1 on Podtrac. But really, in reality, SXM Media is number 1. According to a number of different bits of data. But it was very close that Samsung Free might have been number 1, wasn't it?
Yeah, last week we reported that the automated podcast plays was causing a ripple in the statistics. They seem to have fixed it. Have they fixed it, James? They said they were going to.
Yeah, it looks as if they have. Podtrac actually shared a bunch of data with me around how those, if you remember, Samsung Free, which is a podcast app on Samsung phones, was automatically playing individual podcasts. And at one point, they were responsible for more than 1 in 10 downloads, which is a big number, actually 10.7%. Of all daily downloads on November the 27th. But Podtrac's data seems to suggest that the issue has been corrected, which is good. And Podtrac are also going to pull all of those erroneous plays out of the rankers, which I find interesting because they're still IAB compliant. So theoretically, they should be in the list, but they've pulled those out for the podcast and publisher rankers, which we'll get in the next week or so. Samsung Free's badly behaved app was quite a thing at the end of last month.
Yeah, naughty Samsung. But hey, moving on. We had Trevor last week on the show. I really enjoyed actually chatting to Trevor. He did make a couple of salient points. One of those was that he gets recurring subscriptions through Patreon and other mechanisms. And you mentioned, James, that wouldn't it be good if we could get recurring payments through Satoshis? Of course, that led to a bigger conversation on Mastodon, where I think the most intelligent conversations around podcasting are currently occurring. And you said something about, I'll just say what you said and then I'll leave the mic open. Everything hangs off the GUID. Off you go, James.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was basically saying, look, there is absolutely a way, and I'm sure that there's a way of doing automated monthly money as you would do with Patreon or something like that, but doing it with sats, instead. And I said, I'm sure that there is a way. You'd probably want to just check every single month what the splits still were for that particular show. But of course, if you just store the GUID in your system, then you should be able to find that kind of information, I guess. And we've had a fair amount of interesting conversations, both on podcastindex.social, but also through our boosts as well. Rasta Calavera says, as for monthly contributions for value, an app could do that easily, right? Dave Jones does it with a cron job. Seems like an app could do it easily as well. He said, I appreciate it. And I say he because obviously Trevor was talking about everybody with Bitcoin being blokes. But anyway, he says, I appreciated Trevor's criticism and agree that if monetizing is a goal, multiple ways are great. So, I would certainly agree with that. And I think, Kyrin also said something very similar, that Dave Jones has worked some wizardry. He sends a big rush boost to the mere mortals every week. But of course, you do need to play around with cron jobs and coding and everything else. And so it just needs to be a little bit easier. Are you going to make it easier, Sam, with your super secret thing that you kind of half announced last week?
Yeah, well, there's two ways that you can make this much simpler. So one way I suggested on Mastodon was using the Albi donation page, where you could say, I want to donate to Pod News or to your favourite other podcast, and you could then have a field which had a recurring element to it. So ticket and say weekly or monthly or whatever it would be. That would be very similar to having streaming sats, just you have to have them streaming sats once a week or once a month for a particular amount. Now, Adam put out a, what do they call them on Mastodon? A toot, don't they?
Yes.
He put out a toot that said the value tag has to be protected. So I sort of took that as feedback as, no, I don't like that method. It's a shortcut. Don't do it. But talking to Michael Boomy, that is one way you could do it. Now, the other way to do it is you would need read-write access and authorization to someone's wallet in order to have that payment automatically go out of their wallet into a podcaster's payment. And again, that is something that we are looking at, because you can very, very simply create a UI that would just allow the user or the listener to set their monthly payment. That is not hard. The hard part is getting the authorization to them, once they've agreed it, to take that payment out and put it in. And using the Olby API, it is possible.
Yeah, and I think, I would completely agree with Adam that the value tag is a hugely important thing. And the last thing that we want is for there to be, 50 different apps out there which you have to claim your podcast on 50 different ways, because nobody's going to do that. And at the end of the day, it's just a nightmare. So I can completely get that actually what you want in terms of receiving payments is you want one place to get the information on how to pay that particular podcaster. I think it differs if the payments obviously work in a different way. But I can completely get that. What the last thing that we want really is for lots of different people to have to claim it in lots of different places.
Yeah, and that is the trouble at the moment. Lightning payments are not seamless. So although you have a Lightning address, it is still not easy to interchange payments between those Lightning addresses. It's coming, but it's not quite there yet.
Let's just take a quick break.
We need to change the way we address our nation's issues. It's time to problem solve. We no longer have time to entertain divisive rhetoric that has polarized and divided this nation. I problem solve through very simple means: common sense, logic, reasoning, decency, and most importantly, the truth. I am not here to promote anyone's political agenda. We must realign our thinking. We're the most resilient nation in the history of civilization. We have the ability to stop on a dime and change direction. We need the leadership to do so. I'm concerned we're running out of time. My name is Lou Palumbo, and this is Between the Lines.
Yeah, but I think you don't have to have anybody's permission to pay someone, do you? You only need permission to get money from someone else, which is a very different conversation. Yeah,
Exactly, yes. But it's that authorization of their Lightning wallet. And if it then happens to be a payment into another Lightning wallet, that's not hard. It's the authorization part that's hard.
Yeah, but it's the difference, isn't it, between pull and push?
Yes.
So direct debit, I suppose it's the same as a direct debit.
Exactly.
Versus a credit card. So I can, if I want to take money from you on a monthly basis with a credit card, then you can fill out a form, but you'd have to come and fill out a form on my website and give me the authorization and blah blah blah, which is I think what you're talking about. And I suppose direct debit is the same thing, so I'm not really making an awful lot of sense here. But it's different rather than push. Yeah.
No, I actually thought you were making sense. No, I thought you had a great analogy there. The direct debit is the mechanism. So you're signing a form to in effect a bank, but there is no intermediary, that says I'm willing to pay this amount of satoshis every month, thank you very much, and you have my authorization, as opposed to here's a boostergram, a one-off credit card payment that I am going to do, and you don't have authorization. I set the authorization when I make that payment. Yeah,
and yes, maybe I'm thinking about direct debits versus standing orders, and now we're getting very very UK finance, because I'm sure that they're not called that. I'm sure that they're not called that in the US. But anyway, let's not go down that particular rabbit hole. But it's very exciting that actually there are people having a look at monthly contributions, because I think, Trevor, he said a few things, and I'm grateful for people to have actually listened to what he had to say, rather than doing a little bit of Googling and going, I'm not listening to that. It was very good that they actually had a listen. I think he said two things. He said that Bitcoin isn't really big enough yet, which is something that will change given time. But I think the other one was that actually at the moment, streaming sats and boostergrams require a listener to listen. And it's a good thing if a listener can also say, you know what, I love Sam's work so much that I'm just going to pay him automatically an amount of money every single month, and regardless of whether I actually have a listen or not. And I think it's great if we can build that into the value for value thing. It still absolutely is value. It's still me saying, I really appreciate what you do, but I don't want to have to work to give you money. I just want to basically say, here, have some automated cash every single month, and that should be a good thing.
Yeah, and I think the only thing that Trevor also said was, how do people get wallets? How do people make those payments? How do they get fiat currency transfers? All I can say is it's all coming. I mean, those things are going to happen.
Oh, yes. All of that is coming. And I should also say that we've had a boost from a lady.
Woohoo!
My name is spelt Eileen, but spelt the Dutch way. Shout out to Fountain, by the way, who make it possible to earn sats while listening, so I can send these boosts while still figuring out how to buy them. So maybe that's feedback that I should take back to Fountain. I'm an advisor. So so we've actually had boosts from a woman, Sam.
I only just want to sing Come On Eileen. That's all that's in my head right now.
Oh, here we go. In other payment news, Pocket Casts has raised its annual subscription price by 41 cents a month. They've changed their app from $9.99 to $14.99, and it's only for the additional services that you want to pay for, but it's a good service, and I would recommend that you bought it, as I have done. Radio Public Pro was a thing that Radio Public used to run, which was $12 a month, which was you would get for your podcast, you would get a nice podcast website and an embedded player and some form of tipping service through, I'm going to guess, Stripe. And they've canned that. I'm surprised that it was still going, to be quite frank with you. But anyway, they've canned it. It's no longer existing. They're continuing with Radio Public Basic. And of course, Radio Public is now owned by Acast and has been since February of last year. And you say rumours of subscriptions?
Yeah, Chris Messina posted that Spotify might be bringing out a new tier of $19.99 next year with Spotify. So you've got your $9.99, your $14.99 family, and this is your $19.99. I think the idea is they're going to bring out the HD audio, which was the promised high definition audio version of their music.
Oh, yes.
Plus a few other things. I'm sure they're trying to get audiobooks somewhere into there so that they don't have the Apple bounce out. And again, I'm not a massive fan of subscriptions, I will be honest and say. I would like to see, as I'm very keen to develop, a streaming Satoshi value for value payment system. And I think subscriptions are we don't know what price to set. We'll set a median price, whether you're a high user or a low user, and just pay what you can in terms of this value. And I'm not sure it's the best way, because I don't know whether I get full value with my subscriptions. But hey.
Yeah, and I know that there's a friend of mine who has switched their Netflix subscription to the one with advertising. And just the amount of advertising in there, I mean, it's half the price, but the amount of advertising that you have to wade through has really made them think again. They happen to work in TV advertising, and so therefore it was probably worth their while doing. But the amount of TV ads that they've had to wade their way through is really quite something. But yes, and I think actually, a lot of these a lot of these services who are using advertising as a way of bumping up the value that they get from consumers they really need a bit of a think about what works well for a consumer. I was watching a TV channel, a streamed TV channel the other day, and I saw an ad in the ad break for a dating app. And then that ad finished and then started again. And then I watched the ad for a third time. Then there was an ad for something else. And then there was the same ad for a streaming app. So 4 times in one ad break was, quite a thing. And given that I got married in August of this year, it seemed a bit of a waste of time. Although, who knows? Yes, that's not very good. Perhaps they need some form of artificial intelligence to help them there.
Well, yes, you've been playing with the app of the week, I suppose, or ChatGPT from OpenAI. It seems everyone's been having a little play, and you did as well, James. What did you do?
Yes, I did. So I asked ChatGPT to write an article for me, a 300-word article, about what exciting changes 2023 will bring in the podcasting and audio industry. And I also asked it to finish by making a joke about podcasting. Let me read some of this, but it won't be me reading it. It'll be the artificial voice from Descript. 2023 is shaping up to be an exciting year for the podcasting and audio industry. One of the biggest trends is the use of AI and machine learning to create personalized audio experiences for listeners. Another trend to watch is the continued growth of audio books. And 2023 is likely to see the continued rise of smart speakers and other voice-activated devices. As they say, it's all fun and games until someone starts a podcast about it. So this is me again, by the way, Sam.
Couldn't tell. Seamless.
Great joke at the end. Hilarious. But what was interesting, the whole thing was ChatGPT basically saying, smart speakers and other voice-activated devices are going to be more of a thing next year. Probably in terms of consumption, they will be, even though they've not been very commercially successful, as well as audiobooks, as well as AI. I think it's really, really smart.
I'm not sure I agree with the smart speakers given Amazon's 10 billion hole, but there you go. But other than that, it's probably true.
Yeah, and Adam Curry also posted that as well. And I think there's a big difference between whether or not you can make any money out of it and whether or not people are actually using the technology. And any radio company will tell you that smart speakers are massive and they are getting bigger and bigger in terms of consumption of audio. So yes, they may not be making Amazon or Google any money, but consumers don't care about that. Consumers care about whether or not they're going to use the things or not.
Yeah, it's crack cocaine marketing. Feed the market and then reap the benefits.
But that'll help us monetize this podcast. Yes, Dave Weiner has been saying stuff, hasn't he, as well?
Yeah, he's been using ChatGPT along with everyone else. So he asked, why isn't podcasting owned by a single tech company? And why is it competitive? I can't do Dave Weiner's voice. So podcasting is a decentralized and open medium, which means that it's not owned or controlled by any single technology company. I won't read the whole thing, but he did go on and say, it's basically a very good answer. So he was very happy with what ChatGPT did. I mean, there's been people Harry Morton has said that he's going to use it now for some code snippets. There's other people who've been very impressed with it. Where do you think AI and stuff like OpenAI with Whisper and ChatGPT is going to take us, James?
I mean, I read it and I'm thinking, oh gosh, because ChatGPT is fine, it writes quite well, but it's very dull and it's not actually very accurate most of the time. And I think at the end of it, I kind of get frustrated by some of the writing that I'm already seeing on the internet, which just doesn't look very good. And I assumed that it was somebody whose third language is English. Didn't really understand any of it's just not a very good article. But what I'm dimly realizing is that actually people are already using these kind of tools to write articles. And you're not going to see any of that on the Pod News newsletter, I'll tell you now. So at least not yet. So, but, who knows what's going to happen in the future in terms of podcasting. I think you can still hear, as you heard from that little clip earlier, I think you can still hear when an artificial voice is still artificial.
Yeah, Alban Brook at Buzzsprout had it might have been Kevin, had a really good suggestion, which I've taken on board. So they said in the podcast taxonomy, should we add an extra field, which was AI, so that you could tag a person as an AI in a podcast? So if we did get podcasts that were coming out that were automated, then at least we should tag them so that people know, because not everyone's going to work out what's an AI. They are getting much better, but we should, as the creators, at least tag content so that it's made more aware for the listener.
Yeah, but there again, that would rely on people being honest and open. And I am absolutely convinced that when my daughter is at university, she will be using AI to write her essays. Absolutely convinced that that's going to happen. And it's going to be really difficult to work out whether or not she's actually, in inverted commas, cheated in that way. So whether or not people will actually put a flag, quite a lot of podcasters don't understand how the explicit tag works, let alone anything else. We will see. Stephen Goldstein has also written a very good blog post all about what happened in 2022 and what 2023 might happen. And we will do a review of 2022 next week and make our predictions for 2023, it says here. So that'll be fun.
We will, James.
Yes.
So you have a week to think it up.
Indeed.
You are the font of all knowledge. We should ask you. No, genuinely. I think it will be a good thing for you and I to look back on.
Yeah.
We've done this every week for the whole year. Let's look back on what were the big stories, and also I think what was the trend, and I think make a few predictions. I've got a couple. Anyway, you'll have to wait till next week.
Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to those.
You're the only one.
I am also looking forward to PR companies stopping sending me pieces of lackluster copy about some of their drab podcasts that they've produced during the year, and said, if you're putting together a look back at the year of podcasting, and I'm there going, I write a daily newsletter. Why am I going to write a look back in the year? podnews.net/archive. That's your look back at the year. But anyway, we'll see.
Now, moving on, you posted an updated list of podcasting hosted companies on Pod News this week, James. Why did you decide to update it?
Yeah, there's an awful lot of podcast hosts out there, podcast hosting companies, and I updated it partially because there'd been a bunch added and a bunch added without logos, and one of those that was added without a logo was Co-Host, that happens to be sponsoring Pod News, and they said, why do we not have a logo there? And I thought, yes, that's a good point. The list is actually open. It's on a GitHub page. It's on the OPORG GitHub repo area, and but it's a full list that is also used by people like John Spurlock and others as well. So it's worthwhile going to take a peek at. It's at podnews.net/article/hosts. And associated with that is also another piece of code which looks at podcast host changes. So that's people changing from one podcast host to another. And typically we see about 0.5% of podcasters who switch over a monthly period from one podcast host to another, which is actually, it's a sensible amount. It's around 900 or so from our sample. One of the things that I do always notice every single month is people moving to Anchor and also people moving to Megaphone. And there's a lot of people moving to Anchor, and I think, frankly, that's just people moving to a free podcast host. Maybe they don't want to pay Libsyn anymore. Maybe they don't want to pay Podbean anymore. They just want to host a podcast for free and just dump it there, and that's absolutely fine. But I think also it's fascinating seeing the amount of podcasts that are switching from various places to Megaphone, which, of course, is still part of Spotify. So, worthwhile taking a peek at that.
Yeah, it is good data. Now, James, I wanted to ask you, whatever happened to all the podcast hosts who were getting together to promote Podcasting 2.0?
I can tell you a very little amount of that. Not very much is the quick answer, but if you listen to the new media show this week with Todd and Rob, getyourown.com. That's right, Todd. Then you will find in there that Rob mentions something about that group, and Todd says, I don't think anything's been announced yet. And that's about as far as it's got. And I think this does show that groups of large companies trying to get together to move this industry forward doesn't really work. That came off a dinner that I was at in Dallas in Podcast Movement in August, and here we are in December, and we still don't have that thing, whatever that thing is. So hugely looking forward to the future of that. I think Rob called it a podcast standards group or something. My understanding is that it was all about open podcast standards and RSS and all of that, but we've still heard nothing. So, who knows when that might happen. Maybe it's going to be announced at Podfest. Who knows?
Now, one of the things I've always wanted, James, and I know I've asked you this in the past, is there a table of what tags from the Podcasting 2.0 these hosts support? Because I think, and I don't understand, why some of them aren't doing certain things, like supporting the value tag or supporting the person tag. Some of these simpler tags that can be done straight away, and yet hosts aren't doing it. And I don't know whether a table, a bit like the HTML5 table that used to be published, which showed browsers and the level of support.
Oh, yeah. Caniuse.com. Yeah.
And I just
absolutely
wonder whether we can do one for the industry showing what hosts support what Podcasting 2.0. It would also, highlight very quickly that Apple and Spotify don't support any of it, but that would be another benefit from it as well.
Yeah, that would be interesting. I mean, there's some of that which is already in the data that you'll find at podnews.net/new podcast apps, where you can go and have a look at which podcast hosts support which tags, but it's not very comprehensive. And the difficulty is that, Libsyn, arguably support all of them, because you can put whatever you like into a Libsyn RSS feed, but also Libsyn supports nothing, because unfortunately the only progressive person who was working for that company appears to have left. So you end up with some interesting sort of work there of what do you actually call support. But I think support within the UI, I think it would be interesting to have a look at who supports what. And you're absolutely right, some form of a table, some form of a can I use thing. I have looked at podcast hosts that I wanted to move certain things to, and I have not moved to them precisely because they didn't support the tags that I wanted to. So I think it would be a useful thing to end up working on.
Yeah, I don't mean it as a name and shame, but I do mean it as some podcast hosts are working their backsides off and really supporting it and moving the needle, and others haven't done, much. Now, there are more women coming into podcasting, James. There was a report last week that you published from XSM Media and Edison Research that said 47 million women have listened in the past month. That's 35% of all women aged 18 plus. So that sounds like a very positive thing. Well, that was US, of course, but that sounds very positive, James.
Yeah. it says that 48% of all US podcast listeners are female, and that's a pretty good match for the US population as a whole. This is from the Women's Podcast Report 2022. I find it interesting that you have this, which basically sounds as if everything is getting much more balanced in terms of consumption, but then you have Sounds Profitable's data around podcast creators, which seems to show that there are many more of us, Sam, devilishly handsome men, rather than women.
Face for radio. Face for radio.
Rather than women working on creating shows. So there's still a disparity there, I think. Some good research from Edison Research around women listeners, which I'm sure will be very interesting to the She Podcasts team. And also in terms of research that came out on Wednesday, some brand new research from Edison Research and Sounds Profitable, looking at brand safety and what people basically think of, weird content, unpleasant content in podcasting and the advertisers that are supporting those. And it basically says, don't be racist. That's basically the headline.
That's a good summary. I like that summary.
Yeah, which is, I think, absolutely fine. Anyway, you'll find that at soundsprofitable.com, and you'll find the Women's Podcast Report 2022. They've only released a first look, a little bit of a fact sheet. They will be doing a bit more of a webinar. I think it's next week. And you'll find more details on that at podnews.net.
Now, talking of reports, everyone seems to be doing a Wrapped for the end of the year. It started off with Spotify, and then there was YouTube and various others who were doing it. We got ours, James, for our podcast. What did you think of the Spotify 2022 podcast, or Wrapped video or GIF or whatever it would be called?
Yeah, it was some fancy, HTML5 website. Listen to me, how old do I sound? HTML5 website. Anyway, they call it a treasure trove of growth insights and data. And being fair, it's certainly something, if you want some random catchy phrases to put on your press kit, then it's certainly somewhere to go. Podcasters.spotify.com. For example, we this year have already made 3,057 minutes of audio, which is more than most people have in our category. We're in the top 15 podcasts for something or other, and I can't quite remember what, but nevertheless, we're in the top 15. We this year have had a 69% increase in followers. So some fantastic numbers, and frankly, I would expect for the first couple of months of next year, seeing these types of bits of data in a bunch of press releases, and why not? I should also say that we have virtually no one who listens to this show on Spotify.
Hooray!
It's a tiny, tiny amount of our audience. So I do think it's very clever that Spotify has managed to basically pull a bunch of really good-looking data from this particular podcast, which is not a good podcast in the Spotify ecosystem. And I would compare it with Google, which gives you just raw numbers every single month, and you've got no idea whether they're good or bad, and the Google figures are fairly awful as well. Or with the figures that you get from Apple, which, obviously Apple never sends you any numbers, and the only numbers that you can just get are from the Apple dashboard. It surprises me that Apple haven't done a podcaster wrapped type of thing this year as well that you could actually share with audiences, but maybe that's something that they might do for next year.
Can't beat them, join them. Now, the other value, I think, though, from all this data, I was listening to another podcast and they were talking about how these ranks and charts are great for Spotify. It seems that if you look at the top 10 for 2022 on Spotify, 7 of those top 10 were exclusives to Spotify, and 1 was a recent purchase. And they were pointing out that probably it's a great way for Spotify just to go, who's the most popular in the top 10? Which one don't we have? we'll go and buy it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the same reason, I think, why Acast bought Podchaser, so that they can look for big hits such as that. And obviously, Spotify have also bought Chartable and Podsites as well. I think that absolutely there's a real benefit there. I would say from the Spotify top 10s, of course, Joe Rogan is going to be really, really high in there because Spotify is the only place you can listen to Joe Rogan or to, Meghan Markle or anybody else. And I read a piece in an Australian website a couple of days ago who were very dismissive of the fact that that Australians seem to be listening to Joe Rogan more than any other podcast. And I said to them, no, that's not what the data says. What the data says is on Spotify, people in Australia are listening to Joe Rogan more than anybody else. But that's kind of like saying that Walmart own brand, potato chips are the best selling in America. They're only the best selling in America in Walmart stores because you can't buy them anywhere else. So I think we just need to be a little bit careful of having a look at those top 10s. But as you say, it's a great talent opportunity for Spotify to buy new shows that they want to add to their platform.
Now, talking of talent, as you just did, it's time for People News.
It is indeed. We start with some sad news. Norm Pattis, who was the founder of Westward One and Podcast One, I believe that the phrase is a colourful character. He died last weekend. He was 79, quite unexpected to most people in the industry. So we wish, of course, the rest of his family well. Rob Greenlee has moved on to Podbean. He had been at Libsyn since 2019. He's also worked for Spreaker. He's worked for Podcast One. He's worked for Microsoft and various other places. He's now SVP of Content and Partnerships at Podbean. One of the amusing things is that he's been sent an Apple computer to use. Finally, we only managed to get him off his Windows phone a couple of years ago, and now he's gone wholly over to the dark side, which I find hilarious. So many congratulations to Rob. Congratulations also to Kathy Doyle, who is to leave Macmillan. She's worked for the company for 11 years as VP of Podcasting and Content Development. She is going off for a life of consultancy and starting with podcast strategy for a charity called Hire Heroes USA, and a couple of additional additions to companies. Emma Jane Kirby, who's a BBC reporter who spent 30 years at the BBC. She'd never worked anywhere else, but now she is, because she's working at a podcast company called Blanchard House as a producer. Looking forward to speaking to one of their co-founders in January on this very podcast, so that should be fun. Klaus Thun, or Thun, I'm not quite sure which, but anyway, Klaus has joined Podimo as Global Director of Programming. He used to work for Apple Music and for iTunes. He's also worked for Carlsberg because he is a Dane, and everybody in Denmark must have worked for Carlsberg at one point, you would have thought. And there's all kinds of stuff going on at Harry and Meghan's company as well, Archwell. The head of audio, Rebecca Sananes, has apparently resigned. Serena Regan is her replacement. The CEO of Archwell has also resigned, although apparently she was only standing in during Harry and Meghan's parental leave. Who knows? And frankly, who cares? But anyway, I'm sure that Rebecca will be a top quality hire for somebody else, and I'm sure that she is desperately looking forward to getting out of that kind of goldfish bowl. The amount of press around that podcast is really quite something. But anyway, if you're looking for a job, Pod News has podcasting jobs across the industry and across the world. They're free to post as well. It'll just take 2 minutes to add a new role at podnews.net/jobs.
I wonder if Podimo's new strapline would be exceedingly good podcasts.
The tech stuff on the Pod News Weekly Review.
Yes, it's the stuff you'll find every Monday in the Pod News newsletter, and here's where we do all of the tech talk. Dave Jones gave us a boostergram with this news. Podping.cloud 2.0 is live. Woo! Which is all very exciting. What does that mean, Sam?
Well, if it's what I think it means, now Brian of London had a Hive on the Hive blockchain had a service that looked for podcasts that supported the Podping notification system. We tried to use it in the 1.0 version with PHP, and it was a little bit flaky, and we couldn't work out how to query the database, and did we know which podcasts, etc., etc. So I am hoping that the work that Dave's done with Podping in Cloud 2.0 has made it so much simpler, because I believe he's integrated it with the index as well, if that's what I take away.
Yeah, and I know that there's also a new JSON schema in there which will allow you to, have reason codes and all of that kind of stuff in there as well, particularly around live shows. When listening to the New Media show a couple of days ago, I think what was very clear to me was just the amount of boosts that they were getting as they were going live. Now, we record this at, I think it's 4 a.m. or something in the US at the moment, so it's not a great time to do a live show. But you can very clearly see that show had a lot of people who were sending messages. Once cross-app comments is all working, then that should be pretty amazing too. So I think that's a very exciting thing. And there is a link to what is RSS Cloud, which we will link to from the show notes and from the Pod News newsletter on Monday as well.
Dave Wine is pushing that. He's saying that the RSS Cloud, which is part, I did look, of the original podcast RSS feed structure. So in the channel tag, there is an RSS Cloud tag. I have pinged Dave on a couple of occasions and said, well, what is this, and is it defunct? And then he went, no, it's still alive, and I use it very much. And then I did ask the question, well, what else could you put into that field? Could you put the Podping update into that RSS Cloud field and have it as part of your RSS? I don't know.
Yes, it would be interesting to dive into there. I mean, we should probably not fiddle around too much with the with the very nascent standards that we have, but that was good to end up seeing. Also good is a number of new validators. If you are working on your own RSS feed and you need to validate that somewhere, RSS Blue has quite a nice fancy one. The Livewire podcast validator as well is super good. One of the things that the Livewire one does is it also deals with cross-app comments as well. So if you support cross-app comments, then you can even see those in the validator. I liked it so much that every page now in the Pod News podcasting pages now has a direct link to the Livewire podcast validator, as well as the one that Todd Cochran's company runs as well. So if you want to have a peek at that, then just do a search for your favorite podcast on the podnews.net website, and you'll find a link to it from there. But it works, really nicely, which is a good thing. And talking about cross-app comments, Pod News now properly supports them. So we've stopped linking to Twitter because, Elon Musk is a fool. So instead, we are linking to the Mastodon, ActivityPub stuff, which we frankly should have been doing in the first place. And you'll find the social interact tag in our RSS feed. I would really like to know all of the apps which are using cross-app comments properly using ActivityPub. And it'd be really good to have a look at that. I think one of the problems with that spec has always been that it's been overly broad, and you could support Twitter and you could support something else, and vague amount of random commenting systems. But I'd really like to understand who is using ActivityPub properly, because of course now that many more people are using Mastodon, it works entirely perfectly with that. So that should be really good to have a look at.
You said which apps are using it, but which hosts are supporting it as well, James? Because, from the app developer side, the point at which you put the social interact tag, the link or the URL to the Mastodon, has to be a UI in the host, right? When we create the episode, it can't be in the app. So the app will expose it, but the host has to provide it. And then we go back to earlier what I said. I don't think hosts are actually providing significant tag support in the UI fast enough. I just don't think they're doing it.
Yeah. No, I would completely agree with you on that. And I think that, yes, there's, there needs to be more work. It's that chicken and egg of if there are no apps out there, then no podcast hosting company is going to want to spend the time sticking it in, and no podcast hosting company is going to spend the time sticking it in if there are no apps out there. It's just this whole, roundabout thing. So, I kind of understand that sort of side of it.
But I mean, I have the same problem with podcast.txt. Apart from Transistor, I can't find many other hosts that are supporting it. So then we have the issue of, well, let's turn off the email. Well, don't turn off the email if you haven't put in the podcast.txt support, because as an app developer, how can we verify? We have this disjoint thinking still. It still isn't working quite well.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I should say Buzzsprout, our sponsor, will be supporting Podcast TXT early next month, which should be quite nice. Not sure whether or not that's actually an official announcement, but maybe I shouldn't have mentioned it. But if I shouldn't have mentioned it, then hopefully I won't get into trouble. Not that we're renegotiating for next year or anything.
Can you just go up to the top of that announcement and see, does it say embargo before you announced it?
It was just a chat with Alban. So who knows how much trouble I've got us into. Let's move on.
Move on.
Yes. John Spurlock is doing some nice stuff with the podcast index statistics, which Pod News is also pulling for some of the data that you'll see in our newsletter, which is nice. I have also grabbed some very bad PHP code. I think we mentioned this last week. I published the PHP code to pull OP3 redirect logs for particular days. But having said that, chatting with John Spurlock today over email, I think he's quite close to releasing something which might actually be proper download numbers from the OP3 data. So it'll be interesting to see if he gives us that as a Christmas present, because I am so looking forward to retiring an awful lot of my crappy code. That would be a wonder.
I'm glad you finished that sentence. I thought you just said, I'm going to retire. There's an announcement there.
To retire my awful code. So that would be a good thing. There's a brand new version of Pocket Casts, which is out, version 7.27, which now knows what it's called. It's using that weird fix that Apple released in July, AV URL asset HTTP user agent key, snappy name, snappy thing. And so basically it will now no longer ever appear as Apple Core Media, which is a very good thing. And we've confirmed that. Apple Podcasts has yet to do that. I think I have very severely upset my contact at Apple by asking them very politely, when are you going to implement your own code? And he seems very upset. So let's move on from that. Yes, and there are a couple of other interesting things going on out there. Podchaser has launched an alert system, so you can track podcast episodes for a target key phrase, and you get your first alert for free, which is quite cool. Podverse are working on CarPlay at the moment, although the last that I saw on podcastindex.social, I think they had found a bit of a blocker on that, and maybe they're not working on a CarPlay mobile version at the moment, because there seems to be some problem with that. But anyway,
looking for a decent React developer.
Yes, exactly, which will be, quite a thing. And then finally, Chris Messina, friend of the show, has posted that Spotify is adding hashtags in some way, shape or form. Now, as we know, Chris Messina invented hashtags. He was the person who did that. So I think it's interesting to see that there is now a piece of code in some new Spotify releases which do actually talk about hashtags in there, as well, by the way, as the Hi-Fi service, which is there high definition audio sound. I don't know whether
1999.
Yes, I don't know whether Chris gets any money out of the hashtags. I'm sure he doesn't. But nevertheless, it's a nice thing. So yes, I wonder what they'll be using them for.
And hashtags are coming to Mastodon. It looks like there was an update, so you can now follow hashtags you're interested in and get more posts in your home feed as well.
Oh yeah, you've been able to do that for a long time on the web. It's just the Mastodon app, which actually isn't a very good app. But the Mastodon app now allows you to follow hashtags as well. And if you are using Mastodon or Pleroma and you want to just get some new stuff into your feed, go follow a ton of hashtags. Just search for them and then press the follow button, because that's the way that you'll find new people who you might want to follow in the future.
Moving on now, let's have a look around the world. In Australia, in your backyard, James, the subject of the Teacher's Pet podcast, Chris Dawson, was sentenced to 24 years in prison for murdering his wife.
Yes, he was. He'll be eligible for parole in 2040, and given that he's 74 now, that's probably the last that we've ever seen of him. So still, there we go. In Sweden, consumers are expected to have spent $14.5 million this year on podcast subscriptions. The podcast
I know they're rich in Sweden. That's ridiculous.
Well, that's in terms of the total market. The podcast ad market is worth $34.5 million. If you add those together and you size it up to make it as big as the US market, then that gives you $319 million for subscription revenues, which may or may not be true, and it gives you $759 million for ad revenue. Now, that is pretty well where the podcast industry is in the US. So if the Swedes are paying the same in terms of podcast subscriptions as people in the US are, then that would lead you to suspect that podcasting has hit $1 billion in terms of revenue, and that there's quite some significant money out there to do with podcast subscriptions, which may or may not be true. But I thought that was some really interesting data. It came from MediaVision and the Institute for Ad Measurement in Sweden. So, I just thought that was worthwhile mentioning.
Now, over in the Middle East, Turkey and Morocco, TargetSpot is expanding out into those markets. It's an audio ad company. I've not used it. Have you tried it, James?
Yeah, it owns Winamp. It owns various other things, or rather, I think it used to own Winamp. I think it recently changed hands. But anyway, however that works, interesting that they see there being ad revenue in Saudi Arabia and the UAE particularly, which of course are places that we've heard quite a lot of recently. In Germany, a podcast analytics startup, Voxelize, has raised a pre-seed round of $1.2 million, which is interesting to see. And PodX Group has just acquired a majority stake in a podcast powerhouse. It's a podcast company in Argentina called Posta. It's its first investment in Latin America, but what the company has already invested in is a podcast publisher in the UK and one in, I think, the Netherlands. I want to say the Netherlands, and I'm probably going to be entirely wrong there. Let me tell you exactly where. In France. In France, they've bought stuff in. So we don't know how much. Close. We don't know how much, but who knows there.
Now, moving on to events, just to get you things into your diary, Podfest Expo, Where Your Voice Matters, is in Orlando for January the 26th.
Yes, and I'm hoping to have a quick chat with Chris Krimitsos, who runs Podfest Expo, and find out a little bit more about that over the next week or so. Well, actually, I'm chatting to him tomorrow. So we may hear from him in this very podcast next week. Who knows? Podcast Movement Evolution is coming up in Las Vegas in March. March. And there's also Radio Days Europe, which is happening in Prague, which has a podcast summit as well, which I will be at. So looking forward to that. That is also at the end of March. And the podcast show in London returns on May the 24th and the 25th. There are more events, both paid for and free at Pod News, virtual events or events in a place with people, free or charged. You can choose whatever you want. If you're organising something, tell the world about it. It's free to be listed. podnews.net/events.
Boostergram Corner on the Pod News Weekly Review.
Yes, it's that time again, Boostergram Corner, and thank you, Matt Cundall, who's sent us a Rush boost. What were you doing, Matt, sending us a Rush boost? Is Rush a Canadian band?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Rush isn't a Canadian band, is it? No. Anyway, he has randomly sent us a Rush boost and says, "Hello, James and Sam. Enjoyed the conversation with Dan Meisner." Thank you. Yes, one Canadian saying that he enjoyed listening to another Canadian, which is always a good thing. So, Matt, thank you for that.
Yes, as we mentioned a little earlier, 10,000 sats from Dave Jones. The Podping Cloud 2.0 is live. If any hosting company or platforms need an authorization token, please contact me, which is not me, but Dave instead. Dave at podcastindex.org. Yes, don't contact me. I have no tokens to hand out. That's the summary of that.
Yes. And just by the way, if I may just correct something that I said only a moment ago, Rush is, of course, a Canadian rock band formed in Toronto in 1968. Of course, I knew that, obviously.
So glad you checked. Well, I could see Adam literally going, you two are useless.
Well, particularly Dave. I actually listened to the album 2112, that album, and I listened to it and I thought it was prog rock bollocks. So I stopped listening halfway through. That's probably not going to.
You better get your AC/DC.
Yeah, that's what we need. That's what we need. And Brian of London, thank you, Brian, 1948, an Israel boost. He's just written Podping. Podping uses Hive, of course, which Brian is a big fan of. Now, if you get value from what we do, the Pod News Weekly Review is separate from Pod News financially. Sam and I share everything from it. We really appreciate your support so we can continue making this show. You can support us with cash at podnews.net/weekly support. No one has done that yet. Or you can support us with sats by hitting the boost button in your podcast app. If you don't have one, podnews.net/new podcast apps will help you find a new app like Fountain, for example. What's happening for you this week, Sam?
Well, I was very pleased to say I was a guest on Matt Medeiros' podcast, Audience, talking about why we changed the name of this show. Yes, I did say James is taking over the world. That was the summary. And we did talk about value and micropayments as usual. But I really enjoyed it. So thanks, Matt, for allowing me to be your guest.
Yes, it was very good. I enjoyed that. So thank you for doing that. And it's always slightly strange seeing people talking about your thing and going, oh yeah, that was in terms of the brand. So thank you very much. It's well worth a listen. It's just called Audience, but it's the Castos podcast.
And James, what's happened for you this week?
Well, I have. Firstly, I'm aspiring to be a proper writer. So I've bought. Listen to this. That is a mechanical keyboard. And the kids playing in the other room. That's a mechanical keyboard. I've actually bought a mechanical keyboard, which is very exciting and very loud, and I'm finding it quite difficult to type with. But still, there we are. And the other thing that I have been, and this is very geeky, but nevertheless, I don't care. I'm going to tell you about it anyway. I have learnt the dialogue HTML5 tag. Which has enabled me to get rid of 450,000 pages from the Pod News website, which I'm delighted about. It's also helped me get rid of 450,000 database calls as well. Because instead of having a separate page to kick off a rebuild for the podcast pages on Pod News, it's now no longer a separate page. It's just a little dialogue pop-up. And I'm a big fan of it. And I've enjoyed learning about it. So there we are. And that's it for this week.
You can give us feedback using email at weekly@podnews.net or send us a boostergram. If your podcast app doesn't support Boost, then grow a new one from podnews.net/new podcast apps.
Our music is from Studio Dragonfly. Our voiceover is Sheila D. And we're hosted and sponsored by our friends, our very good friends, our very dear friends. Conversations are still ongoing about 2023. Our very dear friends, Buzzsprout. Podcast hosting made easy.
Get updated every day. Subscribe to our newsletter at podnews.net. Tell your friends and grow the show.
And support us.
The Pod News Weekly Review will return next week. Keep listening.